It was a Tuesday afternoon in the late summer of 1968, inside a private training facility on the edge of Culver City, California. The building had no sign on the door. The windows had been covered with brown paper since the month it opened. There were 11 people in the room. 6 of them were students, seated on a wooden bench along the east wall. 2 of them were instructors who had driven more than 40 miles to watch what they had been told was going to happen. One was a cameraman who had set down his equipment and was standing with his arms at his sides because he had decided, without being asked, that this was not something he should film. One was a man named Bruce Lee, and one was Chuck Norris. Bruce Lee was 27 years old. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 136 pounds at his fighting weight, which was the weight he carried that afternoon. He had been training since the age of 13. He had studied Wing Chun under Ip Man. He had absorbed judo. He had taken apart boxing. He had spent 5 years rebuilding his entire understanding of movement from the ground up, discarding what he called dead wood, keeping only what worked at speed, and what he had arrived at by 1968 was something that did not yet have a proper name, but that every person in that room could feel the moment he stepped onto the mat. His left jab had been measured at 0.05 of a second from stillness to contact. He could drive a 1-inch punch through a stack of wooden boards before the boards could register that a hand was moving toward them. He was not a theory. He was a specific and particular result refined over 15 years of daily work. He had already knocked 2 men off their feet that morning. In the next 2 seconds, he would attempt to kick Chuck Norris. He would not succeed. Nobody in that room fully understood why. Not for several months. And the man standing across from him, quiet, in a plain white undershirt, his hands loose at his sides, would never explain it publicly. Not once. Not in any interview that followed. Not in the years of film work and tournament victories and television contracts that came afterward. He would be asked, and he would say something brief, and the conversation would move on, and the people who had been in that room would carry the story with them for the rest of their lives, passing it through gyms and training halls until it became something that could no longer be fully verified but could never quite be dismissed. This is the account that the people in that room gave, separately over the decades that followed. Stay until the end. What Bruce Lee said when it was over is the part of this story that has never been told the same way twice. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what Bruce Lee had become by the summer of 1968 and what it meant for a man of that reputation to issue a direct, personal challenge. He was not famous yet. Not in the way he would become. The Green Hornet had aired the year before and had been canceled. And Lee had spent much of the intervening period developing what he was calling Jeet Kune Do, which translated roughly as the way of the intercepting fist, and which was less a style than a methodology, a set of principles designed to arrive at the opponent before the opponent could complete a thought. The core idea was interception. You did not wait for an attack to develop. You read the intention before the body had fully committed, and you answered the intention before it became an action. Lee had been testing this against every trained fighter he could find in the Los Angeles area, and he had been winning, and his confidence by August of 1968 was the confidence of a man who has tested a hypothesis repeatedly and has not found a single case that disproves it. He had met Chuck Norris at the Long Beach International Karate Championships the previous year. They had sparred. They had talked. They had developed the particular kind of respect that forms between 2 people who take the same thing seriously. Norris had been training Tang Soo Do for nearly a decade by that point. He held a black belt. He had competed at the highest levels available to him in the American tournament circuit and had not been beaten in 2 years of open competition. He was 27 years old, 6 feet even, 181 pounds, and his kicks, particularly his right side kick and his spinning back kick, were the kind of techniques that instructors demonstrated to their students as examples of what a technique could look like when every variable had been correctly solved. They had been training together informally for several months before the afternoon in Culver City. Lee had been picking apart Norris's footwork. Norris had been studying Lee's hand speed. It was an exchange, and it was genuine, and then one afternoon Lee made a proposal. He said he wanted to test something specific. He said he wanted to throw a single kick. One kick, his choice, his timing. and he wanted to see if Norris could defend it. Norris said all right. Lee said, "If the kick lands, you owe me nothing. If it does not land, you admit that interception is real." Norris said he would think about it. He thought about it for 11 days. Then he agreed. If you want to find out exactly what happened next, what Bruce Lee chose, what Chuck Norris did in the space of 2 seconds, and what the man standing 6 feet away said when it was over, make sure you are subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. This channel exists because people like you found it. Now let us get back to Culver City. The 6 students on the bench had been told nothing specific about what they were about to see. They had been told to watch. One of them, a young man named Dennis, who would go on to teach martial arts for 31 years in the San Fernando Valley, would describe the atmosphere in the room that afternoon as the particular silence that falls when people who know what they are looking at realize that what they are looking at is unusual. He said it was not the silence of tension, it was the silence of attention. The 2 instructors who had driven 40 miles were standing to the left of the main mat. One of them had his arms folded, the other had his hands in his pockets. Neither of them spoke from the moment Lee and Norris took their positions until well after it was over. The cameraman had set his equipment against the wall. He would later say that he made the decision to stop filming because he felt that filming would change what was about to happen, and he did not want to be responsible for that. Bruce Lee stood at the south end of the mat. He was in a relaxed fighting stance, weight slightly forward, left foot leading. He had removed his shoes. He was wearing dark training trousers and a plain white t-shirt, sleeves cut off at the shoulder. He was not bouncing. He was not rolling his neck. He was standing the way water stands in a glass, completely still, with no visible suggestion of what it is capable of becoming. Chuck Norris stood at the north end. He was wearing a white undershirt and a pair of training trousers that had been washed so many times they had faded to a pale gray. He was also not moving. His hands were at his sides. His weight was even. His expression was the expression of a man who is thinking about nothing in particular because he has decided to think about nothing in particular. The distance between them was 11 feet. Lee would later tell a student, not Norris, someone else, years afterward, that he had chosen his kick the moment Norris walked into the room. He said the kick selected itself, the way the correct word selects itself in a sentence you have not yet begun. The room waited. A fight is not 2 people moving toward each other. A fight is a conversation about space, and the language of that conversation is intention. The man who wins the conversation about space has usually won the fight before the first technique is landed. Lee understood this at a technical level that very few people in the world could match in 1968. His entire system was built around the premise that space between 2 bodies is not empty. It is full of information. Closing space generates information. Holding space generates information. Shifting weight by 2 degrees in one direction generates information. The practitioner who can read that information faster than the other can respond to it does not need to be faster in the conventional sense. He is already inside the decision. What he was about to discover is that the man standing 11 feet away had spent a decade learning to give away no information at all. The first second began with movement. Lee shifted his weight to his right foot. The transfer took less than 1/10 of a second. His left hip began to rise. The chambering of the kick was economical. There was no wind-up, no telegraph in the shoulder. No change in the angle of his gaze. The kick was a left lead side kick, the same weapon that had stopped larger men than Chuck Norris in training halls across Los Angeles for the better part of 2 years. Dennis, on the bench, saw the hip rise. The instructor with his arms folded saw the weight transfer. The instructor with his hands in his pockets closed his eyes. He would tell people later that he closed his eyes because he had seen Lee throw that kick 11 times in practice, and he did not want to see what happened when it connected with a man who was standing still. He heard nothing. He opened his eyes. Chuck Norris was no longer in the same place. He had moved 18 inches to his right. Not backward, not into a defensive posture. 18 inches to his right, which placed him outside the travel path of the kick by precisely the margin required, and no more. He had not blocked the kick. He had not parried it. He had moved through the gap between the kick's intention and the kick's execution, the gap that exists in every technique, the gap that most practitioners cannot find because they are waiting for the technique to begin, and by the time it begins, the gap has already closed. Lee's foot passed through empty air at a height of 31 inches, which was the height at which it would have contacted a stationary target. There was no stationary target. The second was the silence that followed the first second, which was a different kind of silence from the one that had preceded it. Lee landed, both feet on the mat. He did not stumble, he controlled the return completely, which was itself a demonstration of the level he was operating at, that a missed technique at full commitment still resolved into a balanced stance. He stood up straight. He looked at the place where Chuck Norris had been standing. Then he looked at where Chuck Norris was standing now, which was 18 inches to the right of that place, and which was also precisely outside the reach of any follow-up technique Lee could have initiated from his recovered position. The distance between them was still 11 feet. Chuck Norris had moved 18 inches and was 11 feet away, and the quality of the air in the room had changed completely. Dennis, on the bench, did not breathe for an interval he was unable to later measure. The instructor, with his arms folded, slowly unfolded them and placed both hands flat on the top of his thighs. The instructor, who had closed his eyes, stood with both eyes open and his hands still in his pockets and his head tilted at a precise angle of 7 degrees, as though he was trying to see something that was not quite in his field of vision. The cameraman pressed his back against the wall. Lee stood on the mat for a moment that the people in the room would later describe in terms that varied from 3 seconds to nearly a full minute, because the people in the room were experiencing a different kind of time than the clock on the wall was measuring. He took one step forward, not an aggressive step, a step that covered ground the way a man covers ground when he is moving from one position to a position that allows him to see something more clearly. He stopped. He looked at Norris. And then he did something that Dennis, who had trained with Lee for 6 months at that point, had never seen him do before. He was quiet for a long time, not the quiet of composure, not the quiet of a man managing his reaction for an audience, the quiet of a man who has encountered a fact and is in the process of revising something. Chuck Norris had not moved from the position he had taken after the step to the right. His weight was still even. His hands were still at his sides, his expression had not changed. He was standing the way he had been standing before the kick, which was the standing of a man who is not particularly concerned with what has just happened, because what has just happened is the thing he expected to happen. He did not extend his hand immediately. He waited. He was giving Lee the time that the moment required. This was the mercy of it, and it was the part of the story that the people in the room would find the hardest to describe afterward. Because it did not look like mercy, it looked like stillness, it looked like patience. But the people who had been in the room and who understood what had just occurred knew that Norris had made a choice in those seconds. A choice to make the ending quiet rather than declarative, to reduce the gap between what had happened and what Lee would need to say about it in front of 6 students and 2 instructors and a cameraman who was pressed against the wall. Norris walked forward. He walked the 11 feet slowly, and he extended his right hand. Lee looked at the hand, he took it. Norris said something. He said it quietly enough that only Lee could hear it. None of the 11 people in the room caught the words. Dennis said later that he saw Lee's face change when Norris spoke, but he could not describe the change precisely, only that it was the face of a man receiving something he had not expected to receive in that particular form. Lee held the handshake for a moment. Then, he nodded once. He picked up his shoes from the edge of the mat. He carried them in his left hand as he walked to the south wall. He stood there with his back to the room for a period of time that Dennis estimated at 90 seconds, but that the instructor, with his hands in his pockets, estimated at closer to 4 minutes. When Lee turned back, his face was the face he had worn when he walked in. He walked to the bench where the 6 students were sitting and he sat down among them. He said nothing for a while. Then he said to no one in particular the kick was correct. He paused. He said, "The space was different from what I believed." That was all he said on the subject that afternoon. The 6 students on that bench would carry what happened in Culver City for the rest of their lives. Martial arts communities are small and they have long memories, and the story of the afternoon left that room the way water leaves a container that has been tipped. It went everywhere at once, and it never quite went back. By the following spring, the account had reached training halls in Seattle and Chicago, and in a particular dojo in the Bronx where a group of practitioners had heard a version of it so altered by transit that the kick had become a punch, and the 11 feet had become 6, and the 2 seconds had become what someone described as a single breath. But the essential shape of the story survived the journey, which is what the essential shape of true stories tends to do. The details shed and gathered as they moved, but the center held. Bruce Lee had thrown his best technique at a man who was standing still, and the man had simply been somewhere else. The 2 instructors who had driven 40 miles discussed it on the drive back. The one who had closed his eyes said that what Norris had demonstrated was not speed in the conventional sense, but a quality of attention that produced movement before the need for movement had fully declared itself. He said, "The problem with being the fastest is that you still have to wait for something to react to. What that man does is different. What that man does is already done." The other instructor said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I know. I have been thinking about that for the last 37 miles. Dennis taught Tang Sudo for 31 years in the San Fernando Valley, as has been noted. He told the story of that afternoon to every intermediate class he ever taught, and he told it the same way each time. And the thing he always emphasized was not the technique and not the result, but the moment after, the 11 feet of space between the 2 men, the hand extended, the quiet words, and the way Lee had sat down on that bench and said the space was different from what I believed. He said that line was the only part of the story that mattered. He said, "A man who can throw a kick like that and then sit down on a bench and say the space was different from what I believed is telling you everything you need to know about how he became the man who could throw a kick like that." Chuck Norris did not speak about that afternoon in any interview for many years. He was asked about it, indirectly, in 1973, by a journalist who had heard a version of the story and who wanted to know what he thought of Bruce Lee's fighting ability. Norris said that Lee was the most dangerous man he had ever trained with. He did not elaborate. The journalist pressed him. Norris said that Lee understood distance in a way that most people spent their entire lives trying to understand, and that he had been lucky enough to have spent time on a mat with him, and that the education had been worth more than he could say. He did not mention the kick. He did not mention Culver City. He said, "What I can tell you is that every session I spent with Bruce Lee taught me something I had not known before. That is not a common experience for a man who has been training as long as I had been training." The journalist wrote a profile that mentioned Lee briefly and did not include the story of the afternoon in the facility with the brown paper on the windows. Some stories wait longer than others to be told. What Norris said to Lee in those quiet seconds after the handshake, the private sentence. The thing that Dennis saw land on Lee's face like a change in weather was not confirmed by Norris publicly. It was reported by 2 of the 6 students independently in accounts given in different decades, and the 2 accounts agreed on the substance, if not the exact words. Both of them reported that Norris had said something to the effect that Lee was the only man he had trained against who had made him move before he decided to, which is a particular kind of admission from a man who does not make admissions, which was, by the account of the 2 students who reported it, the thing that changed Bruce Lee's face. There is a quality that separates the people who become what Bruce Lee became and what Chuck Norris became from the people who do not, and it is not the quality most people assume it is. It is not speed, because speed can be trained. It is not power, because power can also be trained. It is not even knowledge of technique, because technique is available to anyone who is willing to do the work of learning it. It is the willingness to stand on a mat in a room with brown paper on the windows and throw the kick you have been refining for 15 years at a man who is standing 11 feet away and waiting, and then to sit on a bench afterward and say out loud that the space was different from what you believed. The men who cannot say that sentence are the men who stop learning the afternoon they stop winning. The men who can say it are the men who walk into rooms for the rest of their lives with the same quality of attention that Bruce Lee carried into a facility in Culver City in the late summer of 1968. Chuck Norris went on to win 6 consecutive World Middleweight Karate Championship titles. He retired from competition with a record that no one in his weight class came close to matching for more than a decade. He built a career in film that reached an audience of hundreds of millions of people across 5 decades. He is 83 years old as this account is written. He has never, in any interview available in the public record, described himself as unbeatable. That is not an accident. Next week, this channel will bring you the account of the afternoon Chuck Norris walked into a film set where Steve McQueen had been telling people for 2 weeks that he could take any martial artist alive in under a minute. What happened in the next 47 seconds was witnessed by a crew of 63 people, none of whom told the story the same way, and all of whom agreed on the ending. We will see you then.